Which one of the following has not contributed to the growing wolf population in Lozère? We see that this is an except type question. We are looking for something that has not contributed to the growing wolf population in the French countryside. Looking at the options, we see one tells us an increase in woodland and forest cover in Lozère. We see that this is a factor, although indirectly. The third paragraph talks about all the factors which explain the changes. The very first statement tells us this. Various factors explain the changes of the past few decades. One of these factors is mentioned as rural depopulation. Rural depopulation is part of the story. In Lozère, for example, farming and a once flourishing mining industry supported a population of over 140,000 residents in the mid-19th century. Today, the department here is talking about Lozère itself. It's called a department. That's how France works. The department has fewer than 80,000 people, many in its towns. As humans withdraw, forests are expanding. In France, between 1990 and 2015, forest cover increased by an average of 102,000 hectares each year, as more fields were given over to trees. When this happens, the wolves tend to come back into these areas. That's what we mentioned here. So, an increase in woodland and forest cover in places such as Lozère is an outcome of rural depopulation, and rural depopulation is a direct reason as given in the passage. So we find that this is a valid reason, not a valid answer. We are looking for something which is not a reason for the reappearance of the wolf population. The second option says a decline in the rural population of Lozère. This is direct rural depopulation directly given as one of the reasons. We've already checked this out. So this also clearly not the answer. 2 is incorrect. 3 says the shutting down of the royal office of the Lupari. The Lupari are wolf catchers. The royal office and the Lupari are introduced in the second paragraph at the beginning. As early as the 9th century, the royal office of the Lupari, wolf catchers, was created in France to tackle the predators. Those official hunters and others completed their job in the 1930s, when the last wolf disappeared from the mainland. And we see one statement later that says, but in the early 1990s, the animal reappeared. They crossed the Alps from Italy, upsetting sheep farmers on the French side of the border. Wolves have since spread to areas such as Lozère, delighting environments, and so on. We don't need to go that further into details. We see that the royal office of the Lupari had these wolf catchers take down the wolves or hunt down the wolves, but they had completed their task in their job in 1930. Despite that, it is never mentioned that this royal office was shut down. In fact, we can see here in the third paragraph, it says that hunting has reduced a little bit, quite a lot. The decline of hunting as a sport also means more forests fall quiet, as in more forests have less human presence in them. Today, the Fédération Nationale des Chasseurs, the national body, claims 1.1 million people who hold hunting licenses, though the number of active hunters is probably lower. This as compared to, in the mid to late 20th century, over 2 million hunters regularly spent winter weekends tramping in woodlands, seeking boars, birds, and other prey. So we find that if this organization, the Fédération Nationale des Chasseurs, if this is what we are referring to as the royal office of the Lupari, we are not sure if it can be, if it is, but it may be. If it is, then this royal office was never shut down. In fact, it says here, today. So this is very much running today. Even if the royal office of the Lupari was shut down, the passage does not give us that information. So we cannot determine this to be, or we cannot judge this to be true at all. This is outside the premise, hence 3 is a valid choice. 4 says, the granting of a protected status to wolves in Europe, again, a direct reason. We can see this from the last statement of the third paragraph. The mostly protected status of the wolf in Europe, hunting them is now forbidden, other than when occasional culls are sanctioned by the state, plus the efforts of NGOs to track and count the animals also contribute to the recovery of wolf populations. So this has been given as a direct reason. Definitely not what we are looking for. 4 can be eliminated. We find that the correct answer is option 3. The author presents a possible economic solution to an existing issue facing Logère that takes into account the divergent and competing interests of. Now, we have to find 2 groups, as we see from the options. We have to find 2 groups of people whose interests in this particular situation, the return of the wolf species to, or the restoration of the wolf population in France, particularly rural France, their interest in this situation would be divergent, different, and competing. So opposed to one another. That's what we are looking for. Let's try to define the groups. One says farmers and environmentalists. Now, at first glance, this is quite straightforward and a direct reference. There is a certain aspect of closeness to one of the options. So we'll revisit this option once more. But we can see from the first and the second paragraphs that this is quite true. We can see that farmers are against this. They don't like the wolves at all. We can see that here. Tourists enjoy visiting a wolf park in Logère, but farmers fret over their livestock and their livelihoods. We see the same reference once again in the second paragraph at the end. Wolves have since spread to areas such as Logère, delighting environmentalists who see the predator's presence as a sign of wider ecological health. Farmers who say the wolves cause the deaths of thousands of sheep and other grazing animals, livestock, are less cheerful. They grumble that green activists and politically correct urban types have allowed the return of an old enemy. So we find a lot of information from this. We find that, first off, what we are looking for, farmers and environmentalists, they are actually antithetical in their opinion towards the wolves. We see that farmers are against the return of the wolves. So we see here farmers who say that wolves cause the death of thousands of sheep and other grazing animals. They are less cheerful. They grumble that green activists and politically correct urban types have allowed the return of an old enemy. They consider the wolf to be an enemy of them. And we see that same idea here. Farmers fret over their livestock and their livelihoods. Tourists, on the other hand, they enjoy visiting a wolf park in Logère. So tourists seem to be in favor of wolves being present in places such as Logère, which is rural France. Then again, we see that environmentalists, they are also very positive in their outlook towards the return of the wolf. Delighting. So wolves have since spread to areas such as Logère, delighting environmentalists who see the predators' presence as a sign of wider ecological health. So environmentalists in favor of the return of the wolf, saying that the presence of the wolf is a sign of wider ecological health. It's basically a better indicator of a healthy ecosystem. Farmers are against this. They are less cheerful. They grumble against this situation and they fret for their livestock and livelihoods. So farmers are against the return of the wolf. Tourists enjoy visiting a wolf park. So tourists are in favor. Environmentalists are in favor. Farmers are against. We see not too many politicians, but at least one parliamentarian mentioned here in the first paragraph. The wolf must be taken in hand, said an aspiring parliamentarian, Francis Palombi, when pressed by voters in an election campaign early this summer. So we again find that politicians seemingly, from this one reference though, this is just one person, but politicians seem to be against the idea of the wolf returning. Possibly, presumably, because the people are against, the farmers are against this. So the locals are against this. That's why the politicians are also against it. So we find that, yes, the interests of farmers and environmentalists are definitely competing, conflicting, divergent. So one is a valid choice. We can qualify it. The next few choices can be, the next two choices in particular can be dealt with easily. Tourists and environmentalists. We've seen how tourists are in favor from this reference and environmentalists are in favor from this reference. So the tourists and environmentalists, they're both in favor of the return of the wolf species, that is. So 2 is incorrect. The interests of these two groups, tourists and environmentalists, are not in conflict here. They're not competing at all. 3 says politicians and farmers. Again, both groups against the idea of the wolf returning. The politicians saying that the wolf must be taken in hand, and farmers clearly against the idea of the wolf returning. So again, these are groups which don't have interests that are competing or conflicting. So not the answer. Now we come to the close option. Environmentalists and politicians. By what we have seen so far, we realize that environmentalists are delighted at the return of the wolf. That we see here. But politicians, at least from the one politician that we have mentioned here, a parliamentarian, are against the wolf. The wolf must be taken in hand, which means the situation with the wolf must be contained, must be handled, must be taken care of. So it is a problem to them. Let's identify one thing though. Let us not make a mistake of looking at this as a reference to anything to do with politics or politicians. It says politically correct urban types. The subject here is urban types, green activists, those who are in favor of the return of the wolf, and politically correct urban types. So urban type of people, those who believe in being politically correct. Politically correct is a kind of expression where a person is careful that their speech or their writing or their expression, it doesn't hurt anyone. Any particular group or a person is not hurt by anything that one says or does. That is being politically correct, keeping all the people's sensitivities in mind. But that said, what we are talking about here is not politicians, urban people, urban folk. That is not politicians. So this is not a reference that we are looking for. Once that is understood, environmentalists for the return of wolves, politicians against the return of wolves, at least by what one politician we have here is talking about. But that said, their interests are definitely divergent, they're different, but we have to look for something which is divergent and competing. Now, the interests of environmentalists and politicians are not necessarily competing. We can say this because the reason why the parliamentarian, he says this is not exactly given. That is something that we have assumed. When farmers and environmentalists are clearly have clearly competing interests here. Farmers, they fret for their livestock and their livelihoods, their jobs, their source of income. But then the environmentalists are delighted because they see the predator's presence as a sign of a wider ecological health. A wider ecological health is something that environmentalists are interested in as part of their profession. So this aspect relating to environmentalists' profession and this aspect relating to farmers' profession, these are competing interests. They are divergent as well as competing. Environmentalists and politicians, if they are at all competing, we don't know. We don't have that information. We can't say why the politician is making this statement. Is it actually that their interests are competing, or is it just because there's a difference of opinion? Their ideas, their interests are definitely divergent. They are opposed to each other. But are they competing or not? We cannot be absolutely certain. So we find that this option can be eliminated. Now, if that puts us in doubt about option 1, we can go back to it and check. Farmers and environmentalists, we've seen how by profession, these two groups, at least on this aspect, have divergent and competing interests, because a wider ecology or wider ecological health is something that environmentalists would be interested in as part of their profession, and farmers fear over their livestock, so animals, sheep, cattle, etc., that they have, and their livelihoods. So that is a part of their profession or their livelihood, their occupation as such. So these two groups have interests which are clearly divergent as well as competing. So we find that the most appropriate answer, the best answer, is option 1. 4 in comparison is a little inferior. The correct answer is 1. Which one of the following statements, if true, would weaken the author's claims? Let's look at the options. 1 says, unemployment concerns the residents of Logère. Now, we don't exactly know about unemployment or what impact this would have, because the passage does not directly talk about employment or unemployment, but we do talk about rural depopulation as a factor which affects the recurrence of the wolf population in France. There is a strong sense given here that this rural depopulation, people leaving the rural areas, moving to cities or towns, etc., is in order to search for better jobs or better occupations. We see it here in Logère, for example. Farming and a once flourishing mining industry supported a population of over 140,000 residents in the mid-19th century. Today, the department again is talking about Logère itself, has fewer than 80,000 people, many in its towns. As humans withdraw, forests are expanding in France between 1950. So now it has gone into a different argument. We see here that the depopulation is potentially because of the loss of farming and because of this once flourishing mining industry supporting this huge population of residents having stopped working or stopped performing. So the mining has dwindled, and that is why there is depopulation happening at the moment, from 140,000 residents to 80,000 people. And these also, many of them in the towns, not in remote hamlets or villages such as Logère. So we find that unemployment, if that is a concern of the residents of Logère, residents might actually move out of Logère and move to a more urban place to stay, living accommodation, because they'd be closer to work or they'd find work in an urban context. So this would give rise to further depopulation, which means that in all probability, this actually strengthens the argument. If it doesn't, if unemployment is unconnected with depopulation, then also this doesn't make any difference, because it doesn't go against anything given in the passage. So it doesn't weaken the author's claims. So this is not a valid answer. We can eliminate 1. Option 2 says, wolf attacks on tourists in Logère are on the rise. Now, this is definitely against the passage. We can see first off here, tourists enjoy visiting a wolf park in Logère, but farmers fret over their livestock and their livelihoods. So farmers against the presence of wolves or the return of the wolf species, but tourists, they enjoy the wolf species. They're in favor of the return of the wolf species, particularly because we know from this reference, they enjoy visiting a wolf park in Logère. We also have one more reference to tourists, which is at the end of the passage, very last statement. We see it here. Tourist venues such as parks where wolves are kept and the animals' spread is discussed also generate income and jobs in rural areas. So that said, we are talking about tourists being interested in wolves and wolves thus having a positive impact on the jobs in rural areas. But if wolf attacks on tourists are on the rise, then why at all would tourists be interested in wolves? In fact, if this were actually true, why at all would we say here that tourists enjoy visiting a wolf park in Logère? Would anyone enjoy visiting a specific type of park? We are talking about a wildlife park here. It's not an urban park, but a wolf park. Would we enjoy visiting a park where there are high chances that we would be attacked by the animals? Doesn't make sense. So this goes against the idea that is given here. Tourists being in support or in favor of the return of the wolf species in Logère, in France in general, that is something that would be weakened significantly if option 2 were true. So 2 actually gives us a valid choice. We can qualify it. Option 3 tells us the old mining sites of Logère are now being used as grazing pastures for sheep. Again, if the once flourishing mining industry that supported a huge population along with farming, if that mining industry has now been depleted, the mines have been abandoned, so that now the sites of these mines, they are serving or being used as grazing pastures for the sheep, and not as mining sites. So the mining has been abandoned because the mining site has been abandoned. Then this, in all probability, is going to result in rural depopulation. Once again, if we find that mining and occupation and work has nothing to do with depopulation, then this would not affect the premise because this is not directly given. In all probability, if there is a connection between employment and depopulation, then this strengthens the idea given in the third paragraph. So not the answer. We can eliminate 3. Option 4 says, having migrated out in the last century, wolves are now returning to Logère. Now, this is essentially the central idea, the primary argument of the passage, the wolves returning. We see that here. Farmers of grazing animals add another concern, the return of wolves. Eradicated from France last century, the predators are gradually creeping back to more forests and hillsides. So having migrated out. Now, the only difference between the passage and this particular option is migrated out. So the wolves migrated out. They were not eliminated. They were not eradicated. They were not hunted down, as we see in the second paragraph. The wolf catchers, hunters completing their job in 1930. So they migrated out, but the wolves are now returning to Logère, which is exactly what the passage is talking about. It's just not the migration, not the migration, but rather an eradication. It's still not something that weakens the idea that the author proposes, the claims that the author makes. So we can eliminate this option. We find that the most appropriate answer is option 2. The inhabitants of Logère have to grapple with all of the following problems, except. Yet again, this is an except type question. We're looking for something that is not a problem that the people of Logère have to deal with, have to grapple with. Option 1 says, lack of educational facilities. This is very apparent from the first paragraph. We see that Logère has this problem, among others, which are common to most of the hamlets and villages of the French countryside. Residents of Logère, a hilly department in southern France, recite complaints familiar to many rural corners of Europe. In remote hamlets and villages with names such as Le Bacon and Le Baconville, mayors grumble about a lack of local schools, jobs, or phone and internet connections. So a lack of schools, local schools, jobs, and telephonic and internet connectivity. These are problems that, in fact, plague many rural corners of Europe altogether. This is the same as in southern France, and this is also something that is very evident in Logère. But in Logère, we do have one additional factor. Farmers of grazing animals add another concern, the return of wolves. So we find that this is a problem that people of Logère would have to grapple with. So 1 is not an answer. Option 2 says, decline in the number of hunting licenses. Hunting licenses, as we see, is something which would not be taken as a problem. We see it here. The decline of hunting as a sport also means more forests fall quiet. In the mid to late 20th century, over 2 million hunters regularly spent winter weekends tramping in woodland, seeking boars, birds, and other prey. Today, the Fédération Nationale des Chasseurs, the national body, claims 1.1 million people hold hunting licenses, though the number of active hunters is probably lower. So we see that this is not presented as directly a problem that, say, the inhabitants of Logère would have to grapple with. This causes the return of wolves. This causes more forests to, as we see here, this causes forests to fall quiet. So there being less human presence in the forest, which would probably encourage the animals such as the wolves to retake certain land masses, certain land areas, certain territory, which brings them closer. So it is the wolves that is the problem that the inhabitants of Logère have to grapple with. The decline in the number of hunting licenses, that is something which causes the problem. So that is not itself a problem that the inhabitants would have to grapple with. Also, we see here the decline of hunting as a sport. So hunting as a sport is not a kind of an occupation. It is something that people do for leisure, for fun, which had a positive effect of driving the wolves away, as we see in the case of the Lupari in the second paragraph. As early as the 9th century, the royal office of the Lupari, wolf catchers, were created in France to tackle the predators. Those official hunters and others completed their job in 1930s, when the last wolf disappeared from the mainland. But in the early 1990s, the animal reappeared. So we see here that official hunters had been employed as wolf catchers, as Lupari, but there were also others. This aspect, hunting as a sport, people who hunt for sport, this connects with the others mentioned here, not directly with official hunters. So again, we cannot be sure that this is something official that is at all a problem, or is it just because mindset has changed? We do see a change in the mindset. We see that here, they grumble that green activists and politically correct urban types have allowed the return of an old enemy. We also see something like this at the end of this, of the third paragraph. Anyways, we don't need to check that. We find that this is quite a valid choice because this is not a problem that's faced by the inhabitants of Logère. So we can qualify too. Option 3 says, livestock losses. This is directly a problem, the most significant problem that is presented in the passage. 2 references to this. We see it here. But farmers fret over their livestock and their livelihoods. We also see a reference in the second paragraph. Farmers who say the wolves cause the deaths of thousands of sheep and other grazing animals are less cheerful. They grumble that green activists and politically correct urban types have allowed the return of an old enemy. So the loss of livestock is very much a problem that farmers, particularly those in Logère, will face or are facing. So 3 is not a valid choice. Option 4 says, poor rural communication infrastructure. We've already checked this. We had the lack of local schools connecting to lack of educational facilities, jobs, or phone or internet connection, which connects with poor rural communication infrastructure. Phone connectivity, internet connectivity, communication infrastructure, that is poor. So this is also a problem that the inhabitants of Logère face. So we can eliminate this. The correct answer is option 2.